Imagine hiring someone to protect your legacy who just turns around and trashes it.
Don't get too proud of this technological terror you've constructed.
First off, this video isn't anti-Kathleen Kennedy. I'm not in high school, obviously. I'm old as shit. I don't specifically bully someone unless it's joking around, and even then that's very rare and the person knows that I'm joking, so I don't automatically just hate an individual and every time I talk about them I have to hate on them. So this isn't anti-Kathleen Kennedy, even though I think she's made a lot of mistakes. That being said, Kathleen Kennedy kind of backstabbed George Lucas. So most people know that Kathleen has been the CEO of Lucasfilm since 2012 and that her current contract extends to 2021. Also that she worked closely with Steven Spielberg and served as his producer on many films for 3 decades and even helped form a production company with the man. Besides Spielberg, she had a close relationship with George Lucas. George trusted Kathleen Kennedy so much that he hired her as a co-chair of Lucasfilm. Turns out that was a power move by George that just blew up in his face. So let's back up just a little bit to get context for how Kathleen Kennedy just fucked George over hard. So in 2011, George Lucas and Bob Iger had a private breakfast to discuss selling Star Wars to Disney. While George said he wasn't ready at the moment, Disney was the only one he'd sell to, and they'd be the first one he called when he was ready to sell. He mentioned that Star Wars was so important to him that when he dies, he wants Star Wars creator George Lucas to be the first line on his obituary. Bob Iger during this meeting, and after George said that he understood they weren't buying a business, but George's legacy. From there, Bob Iger decided not to push the acquiring of Lucasfilm and Star Wars, and instead waited for George to approach him again when he was ready, which turned out to be 7 months later. So 7 months later, George called Bob for a meeting to seriously discuss selling Lucasfilm and Star Wars. Though they settled for $3 billion less than what George wanted, and George ended up doing so because he got backed into a corner, they came to an arrangement. This included George begrudgingly giving up creative control, which took months for him to agree to letting go of. He reluctantly, in Bob Iger's own words, agreed to be available as consultant for the future Star Wars films, but nothing more. Bob promised despite that, they'd be open to his ideas. Bob Iger also went as far as to buy the outlines for 3 future Star Wars films that George Lucas had written, but Bob let him know, hey, just because we're buying these scripts, these outlines for future Star Wars films, the Star Wars sequel trilogy, it doesn't mean we're contractually obligated to actually go forward with them. But they made it seem like they really, really liked it. And unfortunately, George misinterpreted what they meant. So on October 30th, 2012, George came to Bob's office and signed the agreement for Disney to buy Lucasfilm. Bob talks about how emotional George was about losing Star Wars, but that he tried to hide it. And honestly, if you look at all the photos around that time, you can tell George is really, really not pleased. However, George had a trick up his sleeve. Since Disney and Bob Iger were saying, hey, you have no creative control over Star Wars anymore once this agreement is put into place, George, months before signing the agreement, put Kathleen Kennedy in charge, or the co-chair, of Lucasfilm, and even had her quit working for her own company to do so. And she actually didn't know that Disney was acquiring Lucasfilm, and it was a complete surprise for her that the company she just started running and left her own company for, was being sold. So George was being a bit tricksy, but the reason why George did this was because that he really trusted Kathleen Kennedy, and he put her there for her to run Lucasfilm after he's gone in the hopes that she would maintain his legacy and go down the path that he had already set forward. George had done this as his final way to put someone he trusted as the steward of his legacy after Disney took over Lucasfilm, and thankfully Disney did keep her as president of Lucasfilm after the deal closed, despite being shocked by what George Lucas did themselves. However, it turns out that Disney and Kathleen Kennedy got the last laugh over George Lucas and showed him, yeah, can't trust anyone. So now let's fast forward to Kathleen Kennedy is the president of Lucasfilm. Disney has taken over Star Wars, and George Lucas is pushed to the side. So JJ is the one writing and directing The Force Awakens. Kathleen Kennedy is working closely with him, and then after they start coming up with the plot and all the ideas, they decide, okay, maybe we should run this by George. In an effort to keep George happy and make him feel included, Kathleen brought JJ to meet with George at his ranch and talk about the upcoming film The Force Awakens. There they shared their ideas and where they were going with the plot. Bob Iger reports that George was immediately upset when he realized they were following none of his outlines and nothing of his plot he set forward and had sold to them to maybe follow. Bob also admits that though they told George they weren't contractually obligated to follow his outlines for the next 3 movies, he had thought them buying his story treatments was an implied promise they'd follow them. He expressed extreme disappointment they discarded his stories. Kathleen had not guarded the future of Star Wars as he had hoped she would. In fact, she had decided that the direction George wanted wasn't the direction that they should go in with him gone. This was a slap in George Lucas's face, as he had thought he put someone in charge he could trust to manifest his planned future for Star Wars. Years later, Bob admits that he should have handled the situation better and prepared George for them going in a different direction than what he wanted for his legacy. Bob also admitted that in the first meeting about the future of Star Wars, they had made George feel betrayed. Unfortunately, they didn't heed anything George said at that meeting, and then, of course, they invited him for a screening before they globally released The Force Awakens. When he saw it, he said, yeah, this kind of sucks. Wasn't his exact words, but Bob Iger says that he did not hide his disappointment, and he said that they didn't do anything new, and it just wasn't a good film. He was so disappointed in The Force Awakens that he didn't want to go to the premiere and walk the red carpet, and he had to be convinced to do so. Now, if you're wondering why George Lucas hasn't been more vocal about his dislike of the sequel trilogy, it's because Bob Iger admitted that they made him sign a clause that said, hey, you cannot criticize any Star Wars movies we make after you sign this over to us at all. If you do, you're going to be in big fucking trouble. So George legally really couldn't say how he feels, which I understand from a business standpoint why Disney did that and why Bob Iger had that done, but on the other hand, it would be nice to hear more of George's input. It is his baby. Although you may remember where he did an interview where he talked about selling Star Wars to Disney was like selling his children to white slavers. And yes, Bob Iger did say he was very upset about that, but he figured doing public discourse and going after George Lucas at the time was a really bad idea. So George kind of got shut down after that, which is why you don't really hear him criticizing any of the sequel trilogies anymore, and he keeps his mouth shut quite a bit. Honestly, I think one of the best things from The Last Jedi having such a backlash is that they've brought George back on board and they're consulting with him a lot more and trying to figure out a way to get Star Wars back on track. And from George Lucas's perspective, I bet this feels really good that they feel as if they fucked up so hard that they needed to consult George even more and bring him on board. I don't know, I just imagine him having a bit of not only happiness about that and being able to be back with Star Wars, but also a smugness of, oh, you did need me, you tried to brush me aside, you thought you could go in a different direction, how did that work out for you? Maybe you should have followed my outlines in the first place. So I think George is actually feeling pretty good right about now. So what are your thoughts on all this recently released information about the deal between Disney and Lucasfilm? Do you feel George Lucas was actually betrayed by Bob Iger and Kathleen Kennedy, or do you think he was an idiot to think Kathleen was going to protect his legacy and go where he wanted Star Wars to go after he was gone? Do you not feel bad for George Lucas at all? Hey buddy, you've got billions of dollars just let it go? Let me know in the comment section down below. Also, do you think Kathleen Kennedy was the right person to be in charge of Lucasfilm? Do you think Disney was being nice by keeping her on and making her the president of Lucasfilm after they acquired Star Wars? Or do you think they were just not sure where to go from there, so they wanted to keep as much management as possible?
Thanks so much for watching. Please like the video and subscribe for more Star Wars videos.